When installing flexible hoses, connectors will be needed just as they are with pipe and tubing. The type of connector used with hoses usually depends on the pressure service of the system. For low-pressure systems, a simple push-in connector can be used. As pressure ratings increase, the connectors must be made more firmly attached. Clamps or crimping are common ways of attaching fittings on medium-pressure hoses. For high-pressure system hoses, the connectors may have a special surface that'll grip the woven cloth or metal mesh covering of the hose. Some hoses are stripped to the metal mesh reinforcement layer to install a fitting. This stripping or peeling back of the outer layer of the hose is called skiving. The connector that is placed on the hose in this process is called a skived fitting. Well, let's watch now as the mechanic installs reusable fittings, first on a threaded hose and then afterwards on a hose with a skived end. First, the socket is separated from the nipple of the fitting. Then the socket is put into the vise to hold it securely as the end of the hose is threaded into it. Always start carefully to ensure that the hose is not damaged as it is threaded into the socket. When the hose is completely into the socket, release the vise and check to see that the hose is properly installed and bottomed in the socket. Now the hose is turned around and placed into the vise again. Make sure that the socket is held in place so the nipple and mandrel can be tightly attached. Thread the mandrel through the nipple and using a double wrench, tighten the nipple and mandrel together. Then lubricate the nipple and the socket threads. Now, thread this assembly into the socket of the hose in a clockwise motion. The mandrel forces the hose apart and allows the nipple to slide into the hose without damaging it. Thread the nipple-mandrel combination into the socket. However, be sure to leave about a 1/16 of an inch gap between the nipple and the socket. The nipple nut must be able to swivel freely. In this way, another fitting can be threaded to the nut of the nipple. When the connection is complete, hold the nipple bolt securely with a wrench as the mandrel is removed. Then release the vise, take out the hose, and check the fitting. Now we'll see how a hose with a skived end is attached to a fitting. On this fitting, a mandrel is not used. The marks on the socket indicate how much hose is to be skived. As before, the fitting is unscrewed. This is the skived end of the hose. The outside rubber coating has been removed to allow the hose to fit into the socket. Now, put the socket into the vise so it will be held securely as the skived end of the hose is threaded into it. The skiving acts as a guide to indicate when the hose has been threaded completely into the socket. Release the vise, turn the hose around, and place it back into the vise, making sure that the socket is held securely by the vise. Lubricate the nipple and socket. Then thread the nipple into the socket with a wrench using a clockwise motion. Notice that this is a double nut nipple and that the mechanic tightens only the forward nut. The outer nut is allowed to swivel freely so that another fitting may be attached to it if more hosing is needed on this line. The nut on the non-mandrel fitting causes this type fitting to be thicker with a smaller inside diameter than the fitting that requires the mandrel. This may cause some flow restrictions and must be considered when selecting a fitting. Then release the vise and check the fitting. As with pipe and tubing, newly installed hoses are checked for leakage around the fittings when the system begins operation, and any needed adjustments are made. Well, in our discussion of flexible hoses, we've talked about how they compare with pipe and tubing as a form of connection between plant components. We've seen how the flexibility of hoses gives them many advantages over pipe and tubing. We've talked about how hoses are sized, constructed into reinforcement layers, and how they're installed. Finally, we saw the types of fittings that are used for different pressure requirements. Well, that ends our unit on pipes and pipe fittings.